I don't know if you've ever heard this, that the last things that people say before they die generally reveal what's important to them. And I don't mean just like random, but when someone knows they're dying, right, and they're kind of the last seconds, and they say some things, and those are the things that tend to be significant. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the guy who wrote Sherlock Holmes, last words were to his wife, and he just looked at her and said, "You are wonderful." Isn't that nice? Vince Lombardi, the guy, a very famous coach, as he lay dying, he also looked at his wife and he said, "Happy anniversary, I love you." Last words he ever said. Now, they're not all that good. Winston Churchill's last words were, "I'm bored with it all." Not all that great, but most of the time, it's kind of inspiring. Captain Robert Scott, he was a guy who explored the Antarctic. When he was on this last expedition of his, they were in sub-zero conditions, they were suffering, and he didn't think he was going to make it back. And so he wrote a letter to his wife, Kathleen, and their 3-year-old son, Peter. And among this whole letter that he wrote, he said, "If anything happens to me, I just want you to know how much you have meant to me." And in fact, he never did make it back. So if that's true, and kind of when you know you're at the end, what's really important comes to your mind, then wouldn't it make sense that we pay attention to the last words Jesus said before his life was over? Because he knew it was coming. He knew his life was going to end. He knew it was about to happen. And so he prayed some prayers before this excruciating events of the weekend, and he prayed it within earshot of his disciples. And at least one of them, John, wrote it down. I'm sure he was listening going, "This is amazing, I got to write this down." Or maybe he didn't understand, but he recorded what Jesus said in those last words. And here's what he said. This is Jesus talking. So this is Jesus right before he's going to be arrested, and from then on in, it's just suffering and death. And what's amazing to me is in the midst of all that, I'd be praying for me. Okay, I'd be praying about myself and all my problems, and he did pray for himself, but he also prayed for his disciples. He said, "I will remain in the world no longer." And everybody's talking to God going, "Look, I'm done. But they're still here. They're in the world. I'm coming to you. So, Holy Father, would you protect them by the power of your name, the name that you gave me, so that they may be one, as we are one." But he didn't stop there, because he continues to pray. And then he expands, and this is amazing to me, is that Jesus in his last words prayed for you today, 2022, because he prayed for believers all the way down through the ages. Here's what he said. "My prayer isn't just for them alone." In other words, not just for my disciples. "I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message, all the way through the centuries, that all of them may be one. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. I've given them the glory that you gave me, that they might be one as we are one, I and them and you and me, so that they might be brought to complete unity." Now, if you've been in church your whole life, you've heard these words before. But I find it interesting that the last request, the thing that was most on Jesus' mind right before he dies, was that the people that followed him, that sold out to him, that apprenticed to him, would be unified. It's one of those things that mattered to Jesus. Now, fast forward to today. Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, major split, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. In the time that's happened since then, both of them have had split off into many, many new denominations. By some accounts now, there are 200 denominations in the U.S., just Protestant ones, and 45,000 around the world. And these denominations, they split over questions of theology and orthodoxy. And then, if you go to a local church level, churches split and they divide over the nature of the music, how the church is decorated, who has power, who doesn't have power. In fact, the list is actually kind of endless as to why churches do this. And my point this morning isn't that, divisions and things are not sometimes necessary, but it makes me wonder how good we're doing at following, as followers of Jesus, on fulfilling that last prayer of Jesus. Because then Jesus proceeded to die on the cross and rise from the dead. And what he really said was, and the reason he was doing this, the reason we celebrate Easter, he says, I want to make it possible that anybody who chooses to follow me can live and relate in unity. So just put a picture in your head. Can you imagine being part of a community where there's no discord, no arguing? And I don't mean disagreements. I mean like arguing, where there's no fighting, there's no gossip. People are encouraging each other. Every single person feels valued, that they're worth something, that people care. Sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it? There's a very famous author a few years ago. She wrote a lot of fiction. She, after about a decade of trying, said, "I quit Christianity." Here's what she said. "It's simply impossible for me to belong to this quarrelsome, hostile, disputatious," great word, "and deservedly infamous group." Now, that was her assessment of the church. And I thought, man, that's a long ways from Jesus' prayer, his last words. But let's be honest, okay? If you're honest, there are people you get along with and people you don't. And I think people fall into different categories. So there are those people we really, really like. And you know how you know you really, really like them? You would vacation with them. Okay? That's a small list, right? Sometimes you got a vacation with your family, but when you talk about friends, people you like, I mean, there's a small number that you could actually spend 7 days in a house with, right? Those are the really good friends, okay? Then there's the people that we like, we're casual with. I mean, if there's a party or they're hanging out or we're going to do something, a bunch of guys go to Topgolf or we got whatever it is, they're like, okay, I like these people, I hang out with them, there's no real trauma in this, we get along. A little bit of a bigger list. Then there's I would call the vast majority. These are the people that we're just neutral with, right? They're people that you know and you're friendly with. They don't really affect you one way or the other. You don't dislike them, you don't like them, or you maybe like them a little bit, but nothing really. They're kind of people we like hanging out with, and that's the vast majority of the people. And then there are those that we struggle with so much. We simply find them utterly draining or frustrating to be around. They trigger us. You've had people like that? They don't even have to say anything. You know when they pull up and the car pulls up and they get out of the car at a family gathering, you're like, oh, right? You haven't even talked to them yet. You're already irritated. But there's some people that are like that. And it doesn't matter. Maybe it's something they believe. Maybe it's how they behave. Maybe it's even the way they dress, the way they act, that they never take a shower. I mean, I don't know what it is, right? But there are those people that drive you crazy. So what do you do when you take all of those people from all those groups and you put them all together in the same place and call it the church? Now, if you've been following along with this these past 2 months, we've been looking at this letter that Paul wrote to the church in Ephesus. So this is a very ancient letter, and Paul had planted this church in the city of Ephesus, a very cosmopolitan, very diverse city. And he had spent a good year and a half there. He planted this church. He kind of got it going, and now he's away. He's in prison, but he wants to communicate with them, so he wrote them a letter. He's like, I want to write a letter to encourage you and to help you in your journey as followers of Jesus. And so we've been going through this, and we said last week that the book is all set up this way. And he basically, or this letter, we call it a book, but in the first half of the letter, he says, I'm going to encourage you, I want to remind you of who Jesus is, what he's like, what God's like, what he's done for you. And we've spent the last 2 months kind of looking through that. And the second half, where we're going to spend the next few weeks, is, okay, if that's true, how do you live? What do you do? What does it look like if you're going to call yourself a follower of Jesus? And I find it interesting how he begins. Because remember, he's making this transition now. He's moving from the first half of the letter to the second half. And he does it like this. He says, as a prisoner for the Lord, in other words, he's reminding them, hey, I'm writing this from prison. Like, I don't have any stake in this. I mean, in terms of benefit for me. I want to urge you to live a life worthy of the calling that you have received. How do you live a life that's worthy? What does that look like to you? There's a really good movie, or at least I like it. Remember this, Saving Private Ryan? Anybody seen this movie? It's a very interesting movie. In the movie, an Army Ranger captain, John Miller, he's actually played by Tom Hanks. and his squad, they go searching for Private James Ryan, who was the sole surviving son in this family because the other three brothers had been killed in combat. And so the army says, well, we don't want all four, but it would devastate the family. And so quite unwillingly, they are sent to go find this private, rescue him, and get him home. Right? You remember the story? And so they have this long, grueling search. It culminates in this battle at the very end where most of the squad is killed and Captain Miller himself is fatally wounded. And do you remember as he's laying there, he's against the wall, and the Private Ryan is right there. Do you remember what his last words were to him just before he dies? He said, "Earn this." And it's very interesting, very, very powerful, because what he was really saying was, I want you to live a life worthy of the sacrifices that we just made so you can have a life when this war is done. And the entire movie ends with the very elder James Ryan standing in front of Captain Miller's Arlington grave and saying, I did my best to earn this. So when Paul says to these people, to followers of Jesus, I want you to live a life worthy of the calling you've received. He's saying, look, you have this new identity that I just talked about. I've just spent the first half of the letter talking about, I want you to live a life worthy of that kind of love. And everything from this point forward is how you do that. But what's fascinating to me is what he starts with, because if I was going to tell someone to live a life worthy, hey, you need to live a life that's worthy, your first thoughts might be, all right, I need to be a really good husband or wife. I need to parent my children well. I need to be a generous person. I want to care for people. I mean, if I'm going to live a life that's worthy, I mean, I have to be over and above. I got to serve other people. Those are all the things that we would normally think of. And do you know what Paul starts with? I want you to live in unity. Why? His definition of living a life worthy of the love of God begins with unity. And I would say it this way, unity then is a marker of what it actually means to be a Jesus follower. But how do we live this fairy tale kind of unity when other people bother us just so much? There's some reason that some of you sit over there and you sit over there, right? So you don't ever have to talk to each other. I don't know, is that true? Well, what he does, in the next little part of his letter, he starts to explain the how. He says, look, I want you to live a life worthy of this invitation, and he's focused on unity, and he says, let me tell you a little bit more of what that looks like. So let's get into that. He starts out by saying this, so I want you to be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing with one another in love. So where does unity start? If we're going to be a unity people that are unified, it really starts here. It's based on attitudes that then take action. One of the reasons this is so important is Paul is not inviting people into this private relationship. Like, if following Jesus was just between me and Jesus alone, this is unnecessary. Because his invitation would be, well, just follow Jesus the best you can, pray when you can, talk to God in your own time, listen to the bridge, and you're all good. Right? But that's not it. Because he knows that we were not designed that way, that following Jesus means we are put into community with other people. He knows that's going to happen, so he's like, okay, that's going to happen. In fact, that's how it's supposed to be. I would actually say that if you are not in community, then you're not really following Jesus the way he asked you to. But he says, here's what I want you to do. Here's how you're going to get to unity. I want you to do 3 things. They're all so fun. I think you need to have humility. You know what humility is, right? It's the opposite of pride. And if you read through your Bible, you'll know that God is opposed to pride. He's always been opposed to pride. And it doesn't really matter. Pride comes in a couple different ways. One is feeling really good about yourself. That's the one we're used to. Like, look at what I did. Look at how awesome I am. Look what I accomplished. Look at my house. Look at my yard. I mean, it's kind of that whole, I'm really proud of myself. But then there's the flip side, which is, I'm so terrible. Nobody loves me. I've got no talent. Everybody hates me. They're both pride. You understand that? And the reason is, they're both focused on me. So when Paul says, look, you need to be completely humble. I saw this great definition of humility. It was simply this. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. I thought, that's good. Because that's what humility is. It's saying, okay, I'm not going to be all about me. I'm not going to be obsessed with myself. And then he goes on to say, not only that, I don't want you just to be completely humble, I want you to be completely gentle, to which every guy goes, oh, you're such a gentle man. When guys give each other bro hugs, dude, you're so gentle. This has never happened in the history of Western civilization. We don't say that. And yet Paul's saying, look, this is really important. You need to be gentle. Well, what does that mean? It's connected to humility. And it doesn't mean weak. It actually means self-control, having a tempered spirit. Think of tempered glass, when they do that in automobiles and everything. What they've done is between chemicals and heat and everything, they've made it so that the glass is stronger, that it functions in a way that's way more power. That's the word he's saying. This is gentleness. This means you are under control. And you have the ability to do whatever you need to do, but you don't always exercise it because it's not always reason to. The opposite of gentleness is actually anger, bitterness, gossip, a spirit of revenge. Jesus said actually that his entire way of living was a gentle way. And Jesus wasn't always gentle in how he dealt with people. It didn't look like it. But he said, that's who I am. Again, not focused on me, but focused on the other person. And then he goes on to say, and by the way, this is a self-controlled and tempered spirit, is gentleness. He says, by the way, I want you to be patient, bearing with one another in love. God is described as patient over and over and over and over in Scripture. Patient, 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 patient. We are so lucky. If God wasn't patient, we'd all be dead. Right? That's just the way it is. He is so patient with us. He says, look, now I want you to be patient with each other. Do you know what that means? Tolerating the faults and the grating personality quirks of other people. Impatience always involves, every time this is true whether you're impatient and when you're in Lowe's and you're standing in line, right? I went to Lowe's yesterday to buy something and I looked at the line in the garden center and I thought, no, I'm going inside because I don't want to wait. Impatience, whether it's there, whether it's driving, whether it's people, whether it's with your kids, whether it's with your spouse, impatience always means that I want other people to live up to my expectations and they're not. I want something to happen, and impatience is when it's not happening the way I think it happens. And so Paul says, look, you need to live with patience. And by the way, this is all rooted in love. Very interesting. So Paul is basically saying, look, I want you to live a unified life. That means it's others-focused. Unity always, and I would say only, happens when we focus on other people before we focus on ourselves. You can't have unity any other way. Think of a company, if you're working in a corporation where everybody's only out for themselves. How well does that company work? Doesn't. It usually ends up falling apart. There has to be some level of, hey, we're in this together. If you have a team, a sports team, where there is no unity, it falls apart. Right? There was a basketball team this year that was supposed to be all amazing superstars and all this. They didn't even make the playoffs because they were just this collection of people with their own egos doing their own thing. And the problem is our own egos and our own immaturity gets in the way. Our desire to prove ourselves, a desire not to be criticized, a desire to make sure that we're right. Just because you're right doesn't mean you're righteous. Right? It's just the way it works. Anybody who claims to be a follower of Jesus and is divisive is fooling themselves. Now, this is the problem, because we're not just focusing on me. We're focusing on other people. That's the whole point of all these things that he put here. But here's the issue. That takes effort. It takes time. Paul continues, he says, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. If you don't know this about church, okay, maybe this will be a surprise to you. When you come to follow Jesus, you don't come into a church and all of a sudden it's all good. And all the people that irritated you yesterday are amazing. And all the people you couldn't stand before, you're like, oh, they're like a cream-filled donut. I just want to hug them, and it's all beautiful. That never happens, ever. If they irritated you yesterday, they're going to irritate you today, right? It just doesn't happen that quickly. It takes effort, diligence, intent, and that's why Paul says, I want you to use every effort you got to make this unity. I mean, I got to confess my own shortcomings that I will frequently make some effort. You ever been there? And you think, okay, I know it's the right thing to do. I want to be a good Christian. And so we try and we reach out. And it doesn't work. And we say, well, now it's on them. Did my part. And you know what? I'm wide open to unity. I'll do anything. As soon as they recognize it and they come to me, doors wide open. That is not what Paul is describing. He says every effort. Not some, not a little bit, not here, not there. Every effort. Unity is not easy because it means to exercise humility, gentleness, and patience is time-consuming. So I am not, here I'm going to show you something. I'm trying to do this without breaking it. I am not a model builder, generally. Okay? So you know why? Because I don't have the patience. But there was a time a few years ago where I thought, you know what, this looks really cool. I can't remember if I got it as a gift or not. This is the USS Constitution. By the way, you can see how old this is because I picked up this morning and I thought, I don't remember putting a rigging there, and then I realized it was a spider web. Okay, so it's true. But I remember doing this, and you know, this took time and patience because you can't put it all together at once. And you glue something, and you're like, okay, I want to glue the next part. You're like, well, now I have to wait. I'll come back to it tomorrow. I'll come back to it later. I got to paint this piece. Okay, but now I can't handle it because if you've ever built a model and tried to handle things that you just painted, right? You know what happens? It gets on your fingers, which then gets on everything else. And so it took time, and it took repetition, it took patience. You had to wait for the glue to dry. And if I hadn't done all this, it would have never worked out. It's the only model I've ever kept like this, right? Because of that. When Paul says, and I'm going to try and put this down so I don't wreck it here. When Paul talks about having unity, he's saying, look, you got to make every effort because it's going to take time. It's just not going to happen overnight. You got to work at it. And what I find interesting is that he doesn't say, make unity. What does he say? Keep unity. In other words, Paul's assumption is there is a unity that already exists because of Jesus through the Spirit. So your goal isn't to go create unity, it's to keep it. And he uses this interesting term, bond of peace. It's almost like he's reminding them, he's using the same term that they would use when they talked about the bonds that a prisoner would be under, the chains that he has. And he's saying, look, that's what you're doing. You need to be chained to each other in these bonds of peace to have unity. So the only way we're going to be unified as followers of Jesus is to work at it. Well, why? Why would we go through all that effort? Well, then you don't understand how irritating they really, really are. I mean, I know you talk about it, but I mean, I can't deal with them. They push all my buttons, and besides, their theology is wrong. They don't even believe the right things. How can I be unified with someone who doesn't believe everything that I believe? How can we possibly have this kind of unity? Why would I even bother? Why don't we just split the church, start a new denomination? Well, he tells them why. Here's how you can have that kind of unity. And this is where it always comes back to Easter. He says there's one body, one Spirit, just as you were called. One hope when you were called, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. Paul's saying, look, you're never going to get where you need to go on your own. It's all based on the work of Jesus on the cross. It's the only way you can have unity. It's never because you're very altruistic and you're a really nice person and you have the ability to tolerate other people with a smile. That is never going to get unity. It just isn't. It's all about Jesus. So let me go through this. He lists off, and just in order, he just lists them off. 7 terms. He says, by the way, guys, the reason you're doing this is there's one church. You know Jesus didn't set up different churches. Jesus didn't start by saying, all right, Peter, I want you to start the Lutherans. Okay? John, you start the Methodists. You know, Simon, you're a rebel, so you can take the non-denominationals, right? I mean, he didn't do that. That's not how Jesus went through this. He says, look, there is one church. You choose to become my apprentice. You're part of the church. There's only one. I understand you have different denominations. You do all these things. You have different flavors. That's not even saying necessarily that's a bad thing. But he says, you have to understand, church, there's just one church. Don't think that yours is better than somebody else's. Doesn't work that way. One church. And then he goes on to say, and there's one Spirit. This is really interesting to me because, again, in Ephesus, if you were here earlier, you remember that this is a city with lots of temples. It was very filled with idol worship. There was all kinds of spirits. And so you sacrificed, you went to the temple. So everybody believed in all these different spirits that all had different roles, and some had more power than others. And so you went and, you tried to plead with them. Or he says, none of that. There is one Holy Spirit, just one. And he's the one who's making it all happen. And you say, okay, well, and I kind of know that, but understand this. He's saying, look, he just finished telling them how they have the Spirit. There is a tendency in the church to think, okay, well, I'm listening to the Spirit. You're obviously not listening. You're not really paying attention because he talks to us this way. And so even though we don't say there's different spirits, we kind of elevate the way we listen over someone else. And Paul's cutting through all that and saying, no, this is not on you. This isn't your ability. There's one Spirit. He's the guy in charge. He's the one who's setting the stage here. And he goes on to say, by the way, you got one hope. Found in a calling. His invitation to relationship. That's what he says here. One hope when you were called. That calling, when you hear that word called, it's Jesus saying, come on to me. I want to know you personally. I want you to know me. I'm inviting you into this kind of relationship. And Paul's saying, look, that's available to everybody. That ain't just you. That's available to anybody who wants it. That same hope, it doesn't change. The invitation is always to a relationship with Jesus. Not to a mode of worship, not to a style of music. It's to know Jesus. And that's what gives us hope. It's that relationship. And he goes on. One Lord. One Savior. There is no other way to God. Period. There's no other way. The only way is through a relationship with God. And the reason this is so important is he's talking to people. Remember, Jesus has just died only a couple decades before. This is still very recent. And he's saying, look, all these other gods you hear about, all these other ways to heaven, they don't qualify. It's just Jesus. He was not just a man. He wasn't just a good prophet that was misunderstood. He didn't just teach good things. He was God. And he deserves unity because he's the one who made all this happen. You didn't make it happen. He made it happen. He goes on to say, and by the way, one faith. And basically that's just saying, look, there is one common faith that's characterized by this core convictions as being followers of Jesus. Being a follower of Jesus cuts through everything. And then he says this kind of an odd one. He says one baptism. He's simply saying this, look, the sign, and if you're familiar with baptism, this isn't about how you're baptized, whether you're sprinkled or immersed or all that. That's not the point. Whatever the rite that they did back then, he's saying, look, this was a unifying symbol that basically says, when you are baptized, you're saying, I'm with everybody else that said they were going to follow Jesus. You're all in the same boat. You're all choosing to follow him. And then he wraps it all up by saying, one God and Father. Only one who's ever present, who permeates all things. He is sovereign. He is all-powerful. He is ever-present. And yet, because of Jesus, he's knowable and he's near. I mean, think about that. We get the all-powerful God, but because of Jesus, he can act in our lives. We kind of get the omnipresent, yeah, God is everywhere, but because of Jesus, we actually get to be close to him personally. Do you know how much you have to do with any of that? None. That's on him. His church, his Spirit. He gave the hope. One Lord, his faith. And so what Paul is saying is, look, since it doesn't matter, none of this relies on you, then you can have unity because it isn't based on you. Think about this. If you've been in a club, anybody here has been in clubs. You can be in a car club, a hiking club. You can be part of a sports team. It doesn't matter. But when you're with people who do what you do or like what you like, isn't it easy to get along? Right? A lot of times, like you get in a group and people start talking. And you're like, oh yeah, have you seen the latest in this? Like they're all talking about tech. I'll just pick something off. Photography. And they're like, oh yeah, did you see this most recent camera? And I used this lens and I was going here and I was taking this picture. And you're like, oh yeah, that's true because I learned that. I didn't know that. That's really cool. And you get into this whole discussion. It's amazing how in the moment, you can be very unified. All around one thing. And Paul's saying, look, if that's true, then shouldn't you guys who share this language, this knowledge, this passion of Jesus, shouldn't you be even more unified? Because what unified you is not what you do, but what God did through Jesus for you. Unity is a marker of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Now, if you are not a Christ follower, you can not take this last bit to heart. But if you are, I want you to listen. Because what this means is, if you consider yourself a follower of Jesus, then he's saying you need to be an agent of unity. And you are either an agent of unity or disunity. Not in between. And what Paul says, if I'm going to do this, it's going to begin, if agency is going to begin by showing humility, gentleness, and patience. If you spent the rest of your life just learning to be completely humble, completely gentle, and completely patient, it would take you the rest of your life, but it would be amazing what would happen. It's going to take time, but it's possible because of Jesus. In the end, unity is based on our common changed identity as children of God. I don't know if a couple of you were there on Friday. On Friday, Good Friday, we had a prayer walk in town here. It was really good because it's a service where all the bunch of churches do this together. And it was fascinating to me to watch this happen because as we walked, they had people who would carry the cross, and we would stop in this part of Seaford, and then they would have someone pray, and then we'd walk a little more, and another person would pray. And it struck me as we did that over the course of those different stops, we had black, white, men, women, all praying. We had people pray in English, in Spanish, in Creole. It was fantastic. And then if you were there, and this was a really neat experience, at the very last part, one of the Korean pastor here in town, Pastor Sa, she said, you know what, I want you to do something that we do in Korea. And she says, instead of me praying, what I'm going to do is we're just going to repeat who Jesus is, and then we're all going to pray out loud at the same time. Now, if you've never done that, that's a little weird, because you're like, yeah, but people will hear me. And the whole point was, it doesn't matter. I just want you to pray out loud. It doesn't matter what other people are doing, but you're all going to do it at the same time. And so we did. And if you just sat there and paused and listened, you got a picture of what God's talking about with unity. Because everybody there, they were loud, they were soft, they did it in different ways, in different manners. Some people were very expressive, others were very quiet. It didn't matter, but you know what was they shared in common? They all were followers of Jesus. It's fantastic. See, we get the privilege this Easter to remember God's sacrifice and his invitation to faith. His invitation, we get this privilege of experiencing his grace, his mercy, his love, his redemption, his forgiveness, things that we crave in the inside. We get the privilege of experiencing his peace, the fact that he's close, that we can have intimacy with Christ, because we've all become someone new. One theologian put it this way anyway. He said the church is simply a society of pardoned rebels. That's all we are. And if that's true, no one gets the chance to hold it over someone else. So why does this all matter in the end? Well, two reasons, I think. First is that it is very easy to kill, destroy, distract that which is alone. If you've ever watched the Discovery Channel and a wolf or a lion wants to eat a herd animal, what's the first thing they do? Separate them. Get them away from the herd. And it doesn't matter how big, how strong, or how amazing that animal is, when they are separated, they're toast. You know the same thing is true in life? One of the reasons Paul's inviting unity is because it is way easier for you to be depressed, disconnected, sad, irritated, angry, lonely when you're on your own. But there's a second reason. It goes all the way back to the very beginning. Do you remember what I said, prayed at the beginning when Jesus is praying for his followers through the years to be unified, the last words of Jesus? Right? We ended this way. It said, that they may be one as we are one, I and them and you and me, so that they be brought to complete unity. This is what he's praying. But you know what he says right after this? Then the world will know that you've sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. Our collective unity as the church. If you're not in the church and you're not a Christian, you just get to sit back and judge us, and that's okay. But if we're in the church, it's our love and our care for another, our ability to be completely humble, completely gentle, and totally patient that will tell other people that we actually are who we say we are. So, as we celebrate Easter today, as you have fun with your families, as you eat too much chocolate or too much ham, or whatever it is that you're doing today, but as you have a great day and celebrate with each other and have fun, remember, and may we truly take to heart the depth of the love that God expressed in Jesus, why he did what he did, so that together we can model the love of the Father, which is desperately needed to a world around us.